Recently, I did a review of RWBY ICe Queendom on my channel. In it, I made it clear that not only did I enjoy it, but it made me a fan of RWBY again. Not only was I shocked about how good it was, but it left me wanting more. I don't know if it will become an entire series, but I've clarified in my review that I believe making a separate RWBY series would be a great decision. That said, what would we see in another season of this series? Would it primarily focus on just one character like ICe Queendom, or would it focus on all of Team RWBY? Would it adapt much of Volume 2, or would it go in a separate direction? Or would it go somewhere in the middle? Well, I may have some suggestions on all of that. I'm Marco Strange, and these are my top 4 suggestions for a continuation of RWBY ICe Queendom. To clarify, I have no inside information on the future of RWBY ICe Queendom. This list is just things I think we should see in a continuation if they decide to make one. Also, these are only my suggestions, so feel free to agree or disagree with me in the comments. Last but not least, if you haven't watched my review yet, I suggest watching that first, since I will be going over some points I brought up in it. Now, with all that out of the way, let's jump into my first point. Make Blake the focus of the next season. Near the end of my review, I briefly discussed Blake being the sequel's focus. Like I said in that video, Blake had more focus in the original, as she seemed to be the one most concerned about Torchwick and the White Fang in Volume 2. Not only does it make sense that they wanted to adapt some of Volume 2 to a sequel, but it can be another thing Shaft could improve from the original series. Not only was Blake the most concerned about Torchwick and the White Fang, but she also continued bringing up how humans mistreat the Faunus. The problem is that Rooster Teeth didn't show the Faunus being mistreated outside of Carden pulling on Velvet's ear early on. Even then, you could argue that Carden was only doing that because he's a bully and picks on anyone. My point is that I don't want to only hear Blake talk about this. I want to see how badly the Faunus are treated to understand why she's passionate about it. One of the most important rules in writing is show, don't tell, and showing us what the Faunus go through is more impactful than just hearing Blake tell us about it. At the same time, it could also help explore Blake's past if she was the focus, since she most likely went through hardships for being a Faunus. Having that in a season focusing on her could answer several questions about Blake's past. What horrible things did she have to go through? Was that what drove her to the White Fang and to work side by side with Adam? Again, making Blake the focus would help answer these questions and many others, since we could also get a flashback of Blake when she was younger. Maybe even having a whole episode of Blake first joining the White Fang would be a possibility, so we can understand what led her to do that in the first place. My second point is to have Mercury and Emerald still hunting down defectors of the White Fang. This was another point I briefly brought up near the end of my review. Again, in Volume 2, we saw Mercury and Emerald killing a former member of the White Fang in a bookstore. However, it felt like Rooster Teeth forgot they had the both of them do this in Volume 2. It's not a subplot for Volume 2, and we never see it referenced in any way after. I was expecting it to lead somewhere like we see other former members of the White Fang hunted by them. It almost feels like Rooster Teeth didn't know what to do with that, so they dropped it after one episode. So how could this be improved in Shaft's version of RWBY? It would be entertaining to have a subplot of Mercury and Emerald hunting down former members of the White Fang, similar to how Scar was hunting down State Alchemist in Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. Those fights in Brotherhood were fantastic to watch and helped give you an idea of who Scar was. Seeing more awesome fights in RWBY would be a plus, so why not add this as part of a continuation? At the same time, it can also add to Blake's story. Maybe she notices in the news that these people died, and she knows they're former members of the White Fang. Perhaps she's wondering who's hunting them and if she's next. Speaking of people possibly behind this, maybe she thinks it's one of the big names in the White Fang, Adam. Which leads me to my third point. Fix Adam instead of keeping him as a creep. One of my favorite characters when I was introduced to RWBY was Adam. He seemed like the perfect antagonist when I first saw him. He had an excellent design, they established how strong he was in the Black trailer, and had the ideology that the Faunus were superior and humans should be afraid of them. So what did Rooster Teeth do to capitalize on the great villain they were building up? They made him a creep that was only obsessed with Blake and forgot everything about caring about the Faunus, since he's only obsessed with Blake now. Eruption Fang did a whole video going into more detail than I ever could, but to summarize, they took a morally great character and ruined him. I can't prove this, but watching what they did with Adam felt like they didn't want him to be popular and were trying to find ways for fans to hate him. For the record, what they did to Adam was one of the reasons I stopped being a fan of RWBY. So what's the best route to take Adam in Shaft's version of RWBY? First, keep him and Blake as mentor and student. I know people will ship them together, but that doesn't mean you should automatically make them a former couple. Next, have a flashback showing Blake training with Adam. I think it's best to show as little of Adam as possible and try to build him up for the future. However, I think showing a couple moments of him training Blake is okay, especially if he's relegated to just a teaching role in those flashbacks instead of showing his true power. It gives more backstory to Blake while also expanding on her past with Adam. I will also add that I think Adam should only stick to flashbacks instead of seeing him in the present. Again, build him up for when he and Blake finally meet again down the line. My final point is they should explain semblance evolution more. Originally, I wasn't aware this was a thing in RWBY because I stopped watching after Volume 6. I only found this out because the YouTubers I saw talking about RWBY mentioned that semblances can now evolve over time. As Manga Common put it, the problem was that they didn't set this up earlier in the series. I've seen the RWBY wiki state the earliest example of this was RWBY in Volume 4, turning into multiple clusters of rose petals, but that's not the same as someone like Ozpid explaining a semblance can evolve. Thankfully, ICe Queendom's last episode briefly talked about that. Shion talks about how her semblance evolving was what led her to hunt Nightmare Grim, and explains that Team RWBY and Team Juniper's semblances will grow as well. It makes you know that this is part of the world, and not something they decided to throw in at the last minute. I will say this is the one point I feel isn't as important as my previous points, but I would like to see them have a class going over semblance evolution. Beacon is an academy training the next generation of hunters and huntresses, so classes on semblances would make sense considering it's your unique power when fighting Grimm. I think seeing what a class about semblances would be a great way to build up the world of Remnant and answer a few questions fans are curious about in terms of semblances. It would also be interesting to see a character's semblance evolve to show how it happens. I'm not saying it has to be a member of Team RWBY, and I think it would be too early for any of them to have that happen. However, someone like Pyrrha might make more sense since she is viewed as a prodigy, so you'd think she'd be one of the first ones to have her semblance evolve. Again, not as important as my previous points, but something I think would be fun to see in a continuation. And that was my list of suggestions for a continuation of RWBY ICe Queendom. Again, I can't recommend ICe Queendom enough. If you haven't seen it yet, please give it a watch. Not only does it fix a lot of my problems with the original, but I think a continuation would fix even more problems I had with the original. As always though, I'm more curious about what all of you think. Do you like my suggestions for what they should have in a continuation? Do you have your own suggestions on what they should have? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to see more of my content in the future. I'm Marcus Strange. Stay safe. Stay strange.